Now, it's not just search engines who are engaging in this type of censorship. Social media have been at it as well. The absolute worst of them is Twitter. You may know that Elon Musk has recently put in a bid to take over Twitter, the pretext being to protect free speech. Twitter's had quite an appalling record on this over the last couple of years. Twitter has been quite openly partisan about things, at least in American politics. One way Twitter has been displaying this partisanship is in selective blocking. They've been quite zealous in punishing people for the wrong opinion, so long as that opinion is one that Twitter's top brass disagree with. If you happen to agree with Twitter, you can get away with pretty much anything, including death threats. So banning itself is the extreme end of what they get up to, but there's something called shadow banning, which you should be aware of. This is when someone, say with 10,000 followers, sends a tweet and no one sees it. Twitter have done something with their algorithm to suppress certain undesirables from getting their tweets seen. In a way, this is more insidious than actual banning, because when you're actually banned on Twitter, you know you're banned. But with a shadow ban, you can be just going about your daily business, sending tweets, totally oblivious to the fact that Twitter have done this to you. It's quite dangerous. It's also quite cowardly in a way that they haven't even explained to a person that they've taken their ability to get their voice heard away from them. So Elon Musk has come in and shaken the cage with a rather large bid for Twitter shares. We'll see how well this part of the video ages, but I have a personal feeling that Elon Musk has actually built in an exit strategy for himself here based on the amount of fake Twitter use. It might end up that he never takes over Twitter at all. But at least he's shaken the cage. He's forced a lot of the chief executives to resign, and one of them's openly come out and said words to the effect of, yeah, we're a bunch of communists, which is quite scary, but we pretty much all knew that anyway. One of the most notorious examples of Twitter censorship came just before the 2020 presidential election, where the New York Post was banned by Twitter. That was because of a specific story they posted. So while it seems acceptable for social media companies and search engines to ban misinformation, the real issue with the New York Post banning by Twitter was that the story they actually posted was true. Of course, after the US presidential election, Twitter permanently banned Donald Trump. At this point, I think they were just trying to find out how much they could get away with. Twitter now has a bunch of rivals that do exactly the same thing. There's Gab, Parler, Getter, and one that was created by Donald Trump that's called Truth Social. Yet, to be brutally honest, although all of these platforms are in theory to free speech, none of them yet has a great deal of traction. In other words, there's no one rival that's coming along that's threatening Twitter's dominance of what Twitter does. YouTube is much cleaner and fairer by comparison, although even YouTube has the ability to do something called demonetisation. So what happens is that there are lots of people, I'm not one, who get paid for making these videos. This payment is through the medium of paid advertising that you can display on your site. I'm sure you've seen that certain YouTube channels you might follow have adverts on them. So the YouTube creator will actually get some of the pay for that. So if YouTube doesn't like the cut of someone's jib, they can just say, right, you're not getting any money out of us. But while Twitter is probably still the worst of the tech giants in terms of censorship, it's getting a lot of competition these days from Meta, aka Facebook. Facebook seems to have gone full 1984 about certain things. You may have noticed pretty much every article about COVID will come with a little Facebook truth box underneath it saying what their version of the truth is about anything. God knows whether it's true or not, but it's what Zuckerberg would like you to believe is true. So in addition to the aforementioned COVID information centre, we also have a rather Orwellian climate. If you were to make a certain post about the weather or the climate or certain politics, you'll get a box underneath your post saying, see how the climate in your area is changing. Another one, and this is across a lot of social media, it's these fact checkers that have just come along recently. It's someone comes along with a thought and their fact checkers decide to tell you it's not true. If one thing is certain, that's that Twitter, Meta, and many others have a political agenda They want to suppress opposition to their political agenda, and they want to push it in your face at every opportunity. It's something you have to be extremely careful of. So imagine that Mark Zuckerberg ran for president. He had a high-profile opponent. You can imagine how this would be abused by Facebook and Instagram. Scandals would be dug up, whether they were true or not, over his opponent. All negative publicity regarding Zuckerberg would be censored from Facebook and Instagram. Zuckerberg's opponents could be banned. Worse than that, Zuckerberg's opponents would actually be discredited. So if you published a story about him that was had negative connotations, they would go after you. And those journalists would be banned from Facebook, and mention of them would come up with fact-checking boxes and so on. It's very 1984. In fact, something like this has already happened to an extent. To find out how, you only have to look at the last 2 American presidential elections. Now, in the first one, there was a surprise victory for Donald Trump, and you may recall for about 3 years afterwards, the news was full of stories saying, oh, there was Russian collusion, funny money, impeachments, and this whole thing was played up to 11 on both the regular media and the social media. Fast forward to 2020, and there was another controversial American election, very high turnouts, lots of rumours, strange things going on with certain counts, lots of postal ballots that didn't really make sense. And that story got killed very, very quickly. If it had been Trump who'd won under those circumstances, we'd still be talking about it now. But Twitter went to great lengths to ban anyone mentioning it. And Facebook will be not only smothering the story, but putting their fact checks and everything over it. Both social media and regular media went to great lengths to kill the second story, while going to great lengths to ramp up the first one. So the lesson I want you to take from this is not any specific political point, but it's just that all tech giants seem to be abusing their position. They deliberately exaggerate stories that they like. They deliberately smother stories that they don't. This can be across search engines. This can be across social media. On the whole, I think we still are largely getting the truth. And indeed, there are certain occasions where the things being smothered are the sort of things pretty much every adult would agree should be smothered. Things that promote terrorism, for example. However, are we getting the whole truth? No. And as for nothing but the truth, again, it's the same thing. There's an increasing amount of deliberately told lies that are finding their way into social media under a narrative of truth. That is dangerous as well. It feels like the sort of propaganda that shouldn't exist in Western societies. And you should all be careful of that. So in conclusion, I'd say that if we all went back 30 years, for example, and then we saw a particular story in The Guardian, The Telegraph, The Sun, The Times and The Express, we would all understand that that story would be portrayed in different ways, because each of these newspapers has a different motive and a different political angle. And we would recognise the fact that these newspapers were in some way biased, and we were getting the truth through their eyes. We have to apply the same test to social media and to search engines, because they are politicised, and they are trying to decide what we can see. So when we see a story through one of these channels, we have to recognise the fact that they are trying to force us into a particular conclusion. Should you trust them? To an extent, yes, but you should be highly sceptical. Just like everything else I've been talking about in these videos, it benefits you to be sceptical about everything you're told. How this all ends up is still very much up in the air. We've got the uncertainty of the proposed Elon Musk takeover of Twitter. I think if he does manage to take it over, that Twitter will become a lot better, and the whole social media sphere will become fairer as well. The 2020 US presidential election and the conduct of social media has scared a lot of people around the world, and it was even, of all people, the European Union who've been highly concerned about their behaviour, and they're looking at steps that can be taken. But once again, you have to be very, very careful here, because if a government starts censoring social media, it could make things a lot worse. So if you do distrust social media and search engines, just remember that alternatives do exist. I've been disappointed in DuckDuckGo's compromising of their search neutrality regarding the Russia situation that I spoke of earlier, but I would still consider them morally a much better company than Google. There are alternatives to DuckDuckGo. There's one called Presearch. I don't know a lot about it yet, and I've just come across one called Swiss Cows. So that does need a lot more research. If it's in Switzerland, I tend to trust it more. Regarding social media, as I mentioned earlier, there are alternatives to Twitter at least. None of them yet have traction, but it's worth keeping an eye on them. Because if these rivals truly are committed to free speech, you'll end up with a better set of content and information than if they aren't. Make sure you subscribe and you'll receive a notification when there's a new video on the channel. Please like and share this video, it helps spread the word. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments. And until next time, stay safe online.